In InterSystems IRIS, member inheritance is part of the class compilation process. When you define properties or indexes in a class, the compiler automatically generates additional code based on those members. This generated code handles things like validation and index-based access that you would otherwise need to implement yourself. With member inheritance, a class gains useful behavior through the members it defines. Unlike traditional inheritance, where a subclass extends a superclass and inherits its methods, member inheritance does not involve the class hierarchy. Instead, the compiler generates member-specific functionality when the class is compiled. The functionality generated through member inheritance comes in the form of methods that are added to your class when it is compiled. You can call a member-inherited method just like any other method. However, it does not appear directly in your class definition or as something inherited from a superclass. For example, methods like %save that come from %persistent. In the class reference, this generated functionality appears in the inherited members section. Understanding this helps explain where that behavior comes from. Let's look at a few examples of member inheritance. One common example comes from properties. Data type classes such as %string, %date, %integer, and others define logic for validation and conversion. For example, the %string data type class includes a max_len parameter that defines the maximum amount of characters the string can contain. When you define a property using a data type, the compiler generates property-specific validation code based on that data type. For example, if you define a property called patient name as a %string, the compiler generates a method called patient name is valid. This method applies the validation logic from %string to the patient name property, including the max_len constraint. In most cases, you do not call this method directly. Instead, it is invoked automatically when you call %validate object, which is itself called by %save. This means that when you save an object, the generated validation code runs automatically. Understanding member inheritance helps clarify how property validation is enforced in InterSystems IRIS. Another example involves stored data access. For persistent properties, the compiler generates a property getStored method. This allows you to retrieve the stored value of a property directly using the class name and object ID. For example, patient number gets stored. You might use this when you need a single value rather than opening the whole object. It provides a more direct way to access stored data when full object access is not required. Member inheritance is also associated with indexes. When you define a unique index on a class, the compiler generates code that allows you to open, delete, or check for the existence of objects using the indexed value. For example, if you define a unique index on a phone number property, InterSystems IRIS generates open, delete, and exists methods. These allow you to work with objects using real-world values instead of system-generated IDs. In other words, the unique index becomes an alternate key. Instead of opening an object by its internal ID, you can open it by a phone number. This can simplify your code and align object access with real-world identifiers. It's important to note that this functionality is generated for unique indexes. If you plan to use the index property as an alternate key, it should also be defined as required. Member inheritance in InterSystems IRIS allows your classes to automatically gain useful, member-specific methods. Properties inherit validation, conversion, and storage-related methods from their data types, and indexes generate methods for opening, deleting, and checking objects. These compiler-generated methods reduce the amount of code you need to write and help ensure consistent, efficient access to your data.